Welcome to the 39 Essex Chambers seminar on shortages in social care. I'm Fenella Morris QC and I'm joined by two members of our team, Arianna Kelly and Sian Davies. All of us frequently act in cases concerning community, healthcare and social care. We're alive to the intense difficulties that are developing and have devised this seminar to look at a range of legal issues which we think are arising or are likely to arise. I'm going to speak first of all about immediate challenges to failures to provide and talk about some of the issues in defending them, and also think about the particularly hard circumstances where perhaps a failure to provide might lead to a person staying longer in a situation which amounts to a deprivation of liberty. I'm then going to hand over to Arianna, who's going to talk a bit about difficulties arising when perhaps something is offered to someone, but it's not what they would prefer, and there's a dispute about whether or not that would meet their care needs. Finally, Sian is going to talk about market shaping and fee setting, and perhaps think about the deeper solutions that might arise. Our plan is to speak for roughly 15 minutes each and therefore leave 15 minutes for questions at the end. So if you'd like to put questions in the dialogue box, we'll try and pick them up. And I've been reminded that I shouldn't mention anyone's name, so hopefully I'll manage to do that. And we can have some quite interesting and pithy discussions at that stage. So if we can turn to my session, and it's headed Difficulties in Provision. The first case that I'm going to mention is really quite an old one called K and Camden Islington Health Authority. In fact, it's got the words Health Authority as a bit of a sign that it's from the beginning of this century. Now, that was a case about Section 117 of the Mental Health Act and the aftercare duty, but it's got some important lessons for today, I would suggest. It's a decision of the Court of Appeal, and it was ultimately approved in a later case called H in the House of Lords. The first proposition that we can take away from this case is that where there is a duty to provide aftercare, and I would say that this is probably going to apply to other similar community care obligations, there isn't an absolute obligation to provide. Rather, there's a duty to use reasonable endeavours to make provision. And there's a discretion as to the nature and extent of what's provided, including, and this is perhaps particularly interesting looking back, the court saying that a local authority in that case, or sorry, a health authority in that case, must have regard to other demands on the budget when deciding what it's going to provide and what efforts it's going to make to provide it. Now, getting into this topic of reasonable endeavours, it doesn't mean that if you're asked to provide something and it's sort of slightly awkward, you don't do it. You've got to put your back into it. And you can't simply say you're disinclined to do it. You've got to show that you've made earnest efforts. Now, the real crunch came in K because K was a restricted patient detained under the Mental Health Act, and she had secured a conditional discharge from the Mental Health Review Tribunal, but the conditions on her discharge couldn't be fulfilled. And the impasse in her case carried on for about a year. Now, when the cases were considered by the court, and bear in mind that people's understanding of the law of human rights was probably less developed then than it is now, the three judges all had rather different views about what it meant for Article 5. The majority in that case said, well, if this patient ends up staying in hospital longer than she needs to, because these conditions can't be fulfilled, then it's not a breach of Article 5. But that wasn't the view of all of them. And one of them suggested that perhaps there was a breach of Article 5, but there were interesting questions about whether the responsible body was the state as a whole, whether it was the detaining authority, because obviously that's the body that's detaining her, or whether it was the body that was essentially frustrating the release by not making provision. The other thing that the judges discussed but didn't agree about was this question of if there were a breach of Article 5, whose responsibility was it? And that's that difficult question of, is it the person who's detaining you, the person who ought to be providing, or is it the state more globally? Now, the case went on to the European Court. If you could put the next slide up, please. And it's called Kalanis in the UK. And interestingly, the European Court said that there was a breach of Articles 5, 4, and 5 in that case. And that was because there was this delay of 12 months between the grant of conditional discharge by the tribunal and the opportunity for it to be reviewed again. And the patient was awarded €6,000 plus costs and interest for 12 months delay. Now, it seems to me that there are some quite interesting lessons and possibilities that arise for us thinking about that case and the situation of some of the people that will be trapped with the current difficulties. And I'm going to talk through them a bit now. So first of all, if you are the local authority or the health body who has got a statutory obligation to provide, and you're starting to feel the heat from the patient's side about what it is that you're doing, it's really, really important to keep a clear and detailed record of what you've done, because it's only in those circumstances that you've got a realistic chance of providing a defence to a challenge on the basis that you've failed to fulfil your statutory obligations. And certainly we can see, how you can make sure that social services or other records are filled out with the degree of clarity that's required to meet that need. But in our discussions, that's with Arianna and Sian, one of the things that we've been talking about, and you're going to hear more about it from Sian a little later, is what does best endeavours mean in the context of the market as a whole? So what's the position if, as a local authority, you're aware that your difficulties in meeting need are starting to build up? And you're also aware that you're being challenged on the basis that the rates that you are paying for care are too low. And perhaps it's being said that if you paid more, there would be more places. If you're not grappling with that problem, that sort of holistic or global problem about provision, it seems to us that perhaps interesting questions will arise about whether you're genuinely using your best endeavours. Sian's going to talk a bit more about that in a moment. The other thing that it's important to do if you're imagining that you might end up facing a challenge is ensure that you've got good, clear evidence of budgetary pressures and other associated risks to those to whom you're responsible. And Sian reminded me of this very recent Brent case where the local authority wasn't able effectively to run a defence on the basis of budgetary pressure because it hadn't submitted evidence. And again, it's absolutely vital that you put in some evidence from a finance officer. Don't just imagine that every judge is going to understand that times are hard for local authorities. You're going to need to produce cold, hard data and ally that with some clear descriptions about what spending more on one group will mean in terms of meeting the needs of other groups. So don't just leave it as financial information, but make sure it has a more human face. The next slide. The next thing that it's important, I would say, to bear in mind are the very precise terms of any relief, either at the interim or the final stage, because, and this takes us on to the next bullet point, if you don't meet it, you're at risk of contempt of court. And certainly there have been a number of occasions in the course of my professional life when individuals at a high level in local government have been required to attend court and explain why they haven't complied with the terms of an order. And that's why it's important to be very, very clear about the significance and extent of anything that is either agreed or in deliberations and submissions about the terms of an order, because it's very, very, very important that you don't end up with an order that can't realistically be fulfilled. Next observation I wanted to make was about the Court of Protection, and I wondered whether current circumstances meant that we were due for a bit of a sea change. Of course, you'll all be familiar with the clear legal authority that the Court of Protection can't order any public authority to provide a particular service. But those of you who practice in the COP or elsewhere may be well aware that there are still a few COP judges who seem to think that they can encourage provision in an individual case by inviting responsible authorities to file evidence or attend. Now, I wonder whether in the context of the current crisis, that's a practice that's going to continue, or whether it ought to continue, because of course, the financial burden on any health or social care body that's required to attend is very significant. If it's true that the Court of Protection doesn't have the legal power to order provision, I wonder about how correct it is to try and secure that in other ways, particularly when it means that decisions are being taken out of normal assessment processes. And it seems to me that there are possibilities of risks of inconsistency seeking to placate when it's not perhaps appropriate to do so. I wanted to spend just the last few minutes that I have talking about liability and thinking back to some of the things that the judges were deliberating, although perhaps they didn't conclusively decide in K. What about that patient who is subject to a deprivation of liberty and who isn't able to leave because of these hard-edged problems in provision? And what if, like K, that patient stays in circumstances which amount to a deprivation of liberty for a year? Who would we say might be liable, and who might we challenge? Would we say, well, it's the detaining authority because they're the ones who are authorising the detention? Or would we say it's the provider who isn't coming up to scratch, who's frustrating what really is effectively a decision of the detainer? Or are there going to be cases when in fact the detainer and the provider are one and the same? And would that, I wonder, make it easier to bring a challenge? And then this bigger question, which I mentioned earlier, which Sian is going to help us with as well, which is, you're a local authority and you know that the care providers in your area are complaining that the rates are too low and they can't sustain provision. And you've got a case where you can't secure the transfer out of a dole for replacement for a particular patient. I wonder, could someone say that you're not fulfilling your best endeavours, you're not fulfilling your obligations? And then my last slide, perhaps, again, looking at the way in which the court was looking at it in the case of K, perhaps it's not the local detainer or the local provider. Perhaps the responsibility lies a bit further up the food chain or further upstream, and it's with the state more generally. And is it possible that someone might say either that the government, when making decisions about the way in which resources are allocated, alongside the way in which it makes provisions in relation to deprivation of liberty is not presenting a satisfactory system and therefore fulfilling Article 5.4? Or might there also be some higher challenge, just as there was in K, by eventually going to the European Court? Well, that's what I have to say, and I'm going to hand over to Arianna now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'll be talking about a problem that's quite related, but with a slightly different angle on it, is the question of what happens in situations where there may be some care provision available to the person, but it's not necessarily the care provision that they would wish to have. And I think in a lot of these cases, and I'm looking at this mostly through the lens of the Care Act, is the question is what is reasonable under all of the circumstances? Now, just starting with basics, the Care Act framework revolves around meeting needs rather than an entitlement to any particular services. So obviously different from the pre-Care Act framework in that way. The statutory guidance really emphasizes in many different ways the need for creativity in meeting needs under the Care Act and how it's not one prescriptive way of doing things. But alongside that, and I'll go through some of the relevant statutory guidance on that a few slides down, the focus is really around person-centered care planning and trying to meet the person's needs in the way that they would wish for that to happen. Now, one of the things that we've certainly been hearing is that there may, depending on local authority to local authority, be different shortages depending on the sectors. I've heard from some local authorities that they're really struggling with domiciliary care. I'm hearing about others that are having more issues in their care homes, and a lot of it's depending on the local market. So one of the issues, and I think very much picking up on what Fenella is saying, is this question around the restrictions which ultimately end up on the person. And when you're in a framework where you don't necessarily have the same level of choice of domiciliary care provision to some sort of extra care or supported provision to care home provision, and actually being able to freely choose between all of those because there's not actually the availability in all the different tiers of restrictions, this is something that can prove really challenging because there may be some care out there, but it's not what the person wants and may be ultimately much more restrictive than what they would want. One of the areas in which I think this issue may be particularly relevant is around cases of hospital discharge or where a person may be at significant risks. And certainly in our practice in the Court of Protection, we see many, many cases in which people want to stay in the community, even though it is putting them at significant risk. But that's dependent on a very significant care provision being available in the community to help them deal with their needs in that situation. So in considering the duty to meet needs, one of the cases which I think is a really interesting authority on this, which Fenella will know very well, is the case of Kana and the London Borough of Southwark. This is an older Court of Appeal case from 2001, which deals with the issues of needs versus preferences and around making an offer which does fully meet needs, but it's not what the person wants. In this case, Mrs. Kana very much wanted the local authority to provide her with a package of care in her home that would assist her family and particularly her daughter in looking after her. She put out that this was very much in keeping with her own cultural needs and preferences for her family to look after her, and that it would be very much against what she would want and against her culture to be forced to go into a care home provision. And one of the things that was being considered was that the position of the local authority thought that there was no way of safely meeting Mrs. Kana's needs in her home, and that it couldn't be obliged to put in place a care package that would not fully meet her needs, where the only way of successfully doing that was to provide her with a care home placement. I would note this was a National Assistance Act case. So this is, again, a pre-Care Act framework where there is more of a division between residential care and domiciliary care. But it does make a lot of interesting points, which I think continue to be relevant. One of the points the Court of Appeal made is that there is a real difference between a local authority attempting to do the best that it can in an already existing situation where the person in need declines to accept an offer of residential care that the local authority reasonably considers to be the only type of accommodation appropriate for that person's needs, and compelling a local authority to enter into a care arrangement that doesn't meet needs. And the Court of Appeal found pretty clearly that a local authority could not be forced to put in place a care arrangement which it knew was not a satisfactory arrangement for meeting that person's needs. And in Kana, one of the key points, and I think this is, again, one that's quite relevant now, is that the duties to the person may be discharged if the local authority, if the person unreasonably rejects an offer to meet the person's needs, which fully meets the person's needs in that case. And that was one of the points raised by the local authority, was that it had made this offer to Mrs. Khanna that it could care for her in residential care. She didn't want to accept it. And the question was, what residual duties did the local authority potentially have to Mrs. Khanna, where it had made that complete offer to her and she had rejected it? Now, in considering some of the other cases around this, if there are multiple ways of meeting a person's needs for care and support, a local authority is obviously entitled to take account of its own resources, McDonald being a key authority on that. However, also looking to McDonald, a failure to meet the terms of a care plan as it's written is most likely going to be unlawful, because so long as the care plan exists in a written form and has been agreed between the person and the local authority, if the local authority is not discharging that, that's both prima facie unlawful and almost certainly a breach of Article 8 as well, because the person's needs are not being met in the way that it had been agreed for them to be met. Now, I think one of the key issues that we have to consider right now, where there are these issues of shortages, and particularly shortages around domiciliary care, are what the obligation of the local authority is to take reasonable steps to reach agreement with the person. Now, this is presuming a situation in which a person has had their needs assessed, in which there has been an agreed Care Act eligible need. And looking to sections 25 and 27 Care Act, in either preparing a care and support plan or proposing a change to how needs are to be met, the duty is on the local authority to, and I quote, take all reasonable steps to reach agreement with the adult concerned about how it should meet those needs. Now, the key question here, and I think now really more than ever, is what are the reasonable steps that a local authority would be obliged to take in order to make that agreement with the adult as to how the person's needs are going to be met? And particularly in cases where a person may have a clear idea what could be met, and at a time that was not dealing with such a shortage might be an entirely reasonable step. This provision has been considered in a couple of places, but I'd say no more detail has been considered than in Davie and Oxfordshire. This was one of the key areas of challenge in that case. And this was considered by the court at some length as to what specifically was a local authority required to do to take reasonable steps to reach agreement with the person. Now, interestingly, one of the points that was actually noted against the claimant in Davie was that they had taken quite a legal approach from the outset. And there was some suggestion by the court in Davie that that perhaps demonstrated that the person was not trying to reach agreement with Oxfordshire, which is an interesting point. But I think it does show that this is a give and take of trying to reach agreement is an obligation really that the court will be interpreting broadly rather than one just resting on the local authority alone. The court also found was this was not an obligation to reach agreement at any cost, but to take, again, that same word coming up again and again, reasonable steps to reach agreement with the person. In the Davie case, I think this is always an interesting point in looking at Davie. The procedural history on Davie shows that there had been assessment after assessment after assessment, and that there had been meeting after meeting after meeting. When the court was setting out the history, it looked like he'd been assessed probably 4 to 5 times by the time the matter had actually reached the court. And the court considered that in that case, there had been considerable attempts at engagement, which they defined as a substantial amount of effort over an extended period of time. And the court had asked the claimant what particular reasonable step did it consider that the local authority should have taken to try to reach agreement. And short of simply agreeing with the claimant couldn't actually identify any further reasonable step that the local authority ought to have taken. But I would always emphasize in looking at that case, because I think it is such a key Care Act authority, there had been an enormous amount of process in that case. There had been an enormous amount of evidence in that case. And they were able to very clearly show all of the different reasonable steps that had been taken in order to reach that agreement. I don't think it's just as blunt or as short as simply saying, well, there aren't readily available domiciliary carers. It seems like there would probably be more reasonable steps that a local authority could take in that way. And again, when considering any Care Act duty, it is always very important to look at this through the lens of the well-being principle. The well-being duties include centrally the duty to have regard to the importance of beginning with the assumption that the individual is best placed to judge the individual's well-being, and that restrictions are to be kept to a minimum for achieving the purpose for which the function is being exercised. Now, in considering, and again, looking back to some of the cases Fenella was looking at, if you are suggesting to a person who has needs which are capable of being met in the community that they will have to go into some sort of residential care provision in order to have those met, I do think it's really important to have very close regard to both of those principles in the under the Section 1 duty, and to show how regard is actually being had to those if a person is being compelled to take a care provision which is not what they actually want. Because I do think this is really a very right ground for challenge, and that this is something that would have to be looked at extremely carefully by the court as to how regard had actually been had to what the person wanted, and the restrictiveness of being taken away from their own home for the purposes of receiving care which is possible, which is capable of being delivered in the community. Some of the other points, I noted this earlier, the person-centered care planning guidance is extremely strong in the CARE Act. The CARE Act statutory guidance swept up so much of pre-existing non-statutory guidance and really brought it into one place and gave it so much more force by putting it into a statutory guidance. In section 10, paragraph 1020 of the guides, I always think this is, again, a really key point, is the local authority must take into consideration the individual's preferences, and the authority should consider the person's goals in approaching the authority for support and the level or nature of the support desired. Where the person wishes to take more control over their own care and support, this should be reflected in the route taken. And this is, again, very much coming back to the Section 9 assessment duties of ensuring that you are capturing what the person actually wants to achieve from daily life. And for many people, most people, I assume nearly all people, this is going to be wanting to have the most independent life that you can have. Now, the flip side of this, and I think this is, again, looking at some of the real difficulties which exist right now, at 1027 in the guidance, it does look at this push-pull of the overall budgetary position. And in determining how to meet needs, the local authority may take into reasonable consideration its own finances and budgetary position and must comply with its related public law duties. And this includes ensuring the importance of ensuring that the funding available to the local authority is sufficient to meet the needs of the entire local population. And the local authority may reasonably balance the requirement with the duty to meet eligible needs of an individual in determining how an individual's needs should be met, but not whether those needs should be met. However, the local authority should not set arbitrary upper limits on the cost it is willing to pay to meet needs through certain routes, as doing so would not deliver an approach that is person-centered or compatible with public law principles. And I think this is, again, very much going back to what Fenella said, and I know Sean will be talking about later. It's not enough to simply say that our rates are our rates. There has to be that consideration as to what rates are actually needed in order to achieve a service which meets a person's eligible needs and which meets the population's eligible needs. And if there are questions which have been service-wide particularly for extended periods of time, if these are no longer shortages that are lasting days or weeks, but months or years, there has to be a question asked on a service-wide basis as to whether or not the rates actually are sufficient if there are persistent shortages. And to my view, I think that really does go to whether or not all reasonable steps are being taken to meet the person's needs in a person-centered way and in keeping with the well-being principle. If there are certain segments of the market which are simply not available to the person, and a person is not able to actually have the choices that they ought to be having to have their needs met in the way that they would want that to be happening. And again, I think looking back very much what Fenella said is what steps are actually being taken to address the shortages in particular areas and in particular sectors of the markets, and looking to that evidence and what affirmative steps are being taken by the local authority to recognize those problems and to take action to try to rectify them. In individual cases, I think there are some other steps that would have to be considered around taking all reasonable steps to reach agreement with the person. Now, one of those would certainly be incurring some additional costs in the cases of the person. Going back to 1027 in the guidance, it is very clear in saying that there should not be any arbitrary upper limits to the cost provided, the cost of care provided to the person. To my view, I think that does include some real flexibility around what providers are being used, and that can't just be these are our framework providers and that's what we have. if you are not able to meet the needs through your framework providers, you have to be looking at off framework providers. You have to be looking at subsidies. You have to be talking actively with the providers about what they need in order to be able to deliver that. Another point, which I think is also an important one to look at, is flexibility around direct payments and the use of friends, family members, including those who live in the same household, to try to expand the available pool of people willing to provide care and support to the person. I have seen a lot of cases where there is sometimes a very rigid approach taken to paying family members on the basis of necessity, which obviously is the test under the regulations to providing direct payments to a person living in the same household. However, if the question is whether the person's need will be met or not, and there is no real provision that helps the person achieve the goals that they want to achieve, the local authority does have to really ask itself, is it necessary in this case? And the answer may well be yes under those circumstances. So that's my sort of whistle-stop tour. Now Sean is going to be taking you on to some of the more market shaping and broader duties around the CARE Act.
Thank you very much. So I am going to take a step back from the difficulties that have been identified and look at some of the underpinning statutory duties and raise the question really of what local authorities should be doing to plan for what is happening and also to plan for how it might be addressed in the future. So if I could have the next slide. Thank you. So there are just some resources there. I'm not going to go through those, but on the next slide, we do have just really an outline of the key statutory provisions. So obviously we have section 5 of the CARE Act, which requires a local authority effectively to engage in strategic thinking about how the market is, and the core duty is to promote the efficient and effective operation of a market in services for meeting care and support needs. Obviously, it's a must-have regard duty, but if it's not already clear, section 5.4 makes clear the relationship between this duty and the duty that Arianna has talked about, the well-being principle, which of course is applicable to the performance of all functions under the CARE Act. And really it's the intersection of resources and well-being that we're talking about here. So the guidance talks about promoting diversity and quality in the care market. The aim is to achieve a vibrant, responsive market, and the mechanism for achieving that is said to be by having an understanding of the market, by undertaking commissioning duties, and if necessary by intervening in the market to ensure that that is achieved. These are not new concepts, and the idea of having a joint strategic needs assessment and a joint health and wellbeing strategy predated the CARE Act, and we can see that from guidance that was issued under the National Assistance Act. So these are not new duties on a local authority and health bodies to plan strategically. What is a joint strategic needs assessment? We see from the Care and Support Statutory Guidance that it is an assessment of local needs, that it is intended to look at current and future health and care needs of the local population in order to inform and guide planning and commissioning of health, wellbeing and social care services within the area. It's really the anticipating needs part that we're focusing on at the moment, because obviously because of certain circumstances, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, the situation is not stable, and there are changes to the profile of need and the profile of provision that need to be factored into that joint strategic needs assessment. So the market position statement again is addressed in the statutory guidance, and it is a way of showing that the section 5 duty is being met. The means of doing that is to have effectively a supply and demand analysis, but not just supply and demand now, but anticipated supply and demand in the future. And so that's where the link comes in between the market position statement and the joint strategic needs assessment, joint health and wellbeing strategy. The joint strategic needs assessment and health and wellbeing strategy ought to be planning for anticipated needs. The market position statement is about how those needs are capable of being met within the market, and what adjustments to the market are needed in order for those needs to be met. A market position statement is supposed to set out the following: what support and care services people need and how they need them to be provided, the support and services available at the moment, and importantly, given the topic, what is not available but needs to be, in other words, identifying gaps in the market. What support and care services the council thinks people will need in the future, so that's the anticipatory part. And what the future of care and support will be like locally, how it will be funded and purchased. And how it will be funded is really a very important part of what we're talking about, because one of the issues that Arianna's identified is local authorities having to grapple with the question of whether the rates that they're offering for care are sufficient. In other words, whether what they're paying is enough to attract providers into the market if there is a shortage of providers. And if those rates are not sufficient, what is the impact on the local authority adult social care budget? And how does that then impact on the council's budgetary decisions overall? So that part of it really needs to go beyond the here and now and into the sort of the next round of budgetary considerations. And finally, how commissioners want to shape the opportunities that will be available. In other words, what changes need to be made and how can the market achieve that? The reality, of course, I think we're all aware of the statistics, that they're all over the press. This is one set of statistics, which is that there are currently 100,000 vacancies in social care, with an estimate that by 2035 there will be a need for an extra 490,000 carers. Whatever the statistics, I think everyone who works in this area is aware of the reality, which is that there is a chronic shortage at the moment of care provision. We have what might just be described as a perfect storm at the moment, because there is a lot of change underway in the social care sector. If we could have the next slide. One of the aspects of that change is the Building Back Better command paper, which came out in September. And part of that command paper strategy it is to introduce the long-awaited cap on care costs, with the suggestion in the command paper that there will effectively be parity between the rates that are paid by those who are self-funding care and those who are funded by the local authority. The question is whether that will involve the self-funders paying less or the local authorities paying more. And so that is one of the sort of factors that's going to be affecting the market. The next slide sets out a number of other factors that I think we're all aware of, which are going to have inevitable impact on the care market: increase in minimum wage, rise in national insurance, ironically for the purpose of funding health and social care. Obviously the impact of Brexit on staffing issues, staff availability, other increases that care providers are subject to, for example, petrol and energy costs, and of course on the supply side in terms of carers, the vaccine requirement which came into force last week. So all of those factors have an impact in addition to the Build Back Better command paper proposal for the cap. So it might be described as a perfect storm. So how are local authorities going to comply with the Section 5 duty? Well, the starting point is that all of these impacts on the market need to be factored into the Joint Strategic Needs Assessment, which is meant to be a sort of dynamic document, and the Market Position Statement. Again, these documents, these policies have to take account of changes to supply and demand. Local authorities need to be identifying risks of provider failure, and there is specific provision for that in the Care Act and in the Care and Support Business Failure Regulations. And the idea behind those provisions is to ensure that care and support needs of service users are protected in the event of business failure. But ideally, what local authorities want to do is to take steps before the point of failure is reached. Moving on, obviously the main sort of risk or vulnerability is care home closures and provider failure. But then the consequential vulnerabilities are local authorities not being able to meet eligible needs because of an inadequate supply of care staff. While it is the case that resources can be taken into account in decisions about how needs are met, ultimately where eligible needs are identified, there is a duty to meet those needs. And so relying on resource issues is only a relevant consideration for local authorities where they have a choice of ways to meet needs, but it's not an answer to whether needs should be met at all. And so we have the question of local authorities being vulnerable in the sense of not being able to comply with duties to meet needs. We also have the increased level of restriction, and this goes back to what Fenella was saying about the duties upon those who are potentially depriving someone of their liberty. Because the situation can arise that in registered and community settings, a greater level of restriction is imposed because of insufficient staffing. And that gives rise to the question as to whether the least restrictive principle under the Mental Capacity Act is being complied with, and also whether the necessary and proportionate test under liberty protection safeguards is going to be complied with once the LPS comes into force. So there are a number of really very significant vulnerabilities there in terms of ability to meet duties and to secure the least restrictive alternative. I think probably the key point is that it's not just a case of local authorities being stuck with the rate that is paid, and the strategic needs assessment, the market position statement need to address the question of whether the rate is sufficient for the market to be able to respond. And in some cases, the answer is going to be that if there is not sufficient capacity within the care market at the current rate, the question has to be asked whether that needs to involve an increase in rates, and the consequential decisions that surround that, such as increased budgets, and the impact on that of council tax setting. And of course, all of these are decisions that have to be made well in advance, rather than as a crisis response to a situation that has arisen. So the last slide that I have is effectively the exam question, but you don't have to answer it. But it's really just meant to be an illustration of the sort of situation that arises from these tensions that we've talked about in the care market. So this is someone who's in a care home subject to a dole's authorisation. She does have a home she could return to. Her son lives in that home, and the assessment is that she could reside there on a trial basis if she had 24/7 live-in care, but there isn't a care agency able to provide that care. and agencies have said that they don't have the capacity to assess. She has been assessed as needing some one-to-one support in the care home to lessen her level of distress at being there, but the funding authority again says that that isn't available because of staffing issues. She's reported to be distressed on a daily basis, wanting to go home, doesn't take part in group activities within the care home, staying alone in her bedroom. And so you've got really two core issues there. The first is that there is a less restrictive option in that she could live in her own home, but only with the 24/7 living care, which can't be sourced at the moment. And the second is obviously on an immediate basis, she has a need for one-to-one support, and that also isn't being provided. And again, there's a question about whether the level of restriction is greater because of that. And ultimately what it comes down to is the question of whether there is an absolute duty to meet those eligible needs, and whether meeting those eligible needs comes at a cost which is greater than that which the authority at present is saying it is willing to pay. Thank you very much. That is all I have to say, but of course we're very happy to answer questions.
So I was going to start dealing with the questions. We've got a particularly excellent crop. I was going to start with a few and hopefully pass on to Arianna to deal with some of the cost cap ones, because I know she enjoys those. And then perhaps Sean and I can sweep up some more when we've had a chance to think while Arianna's speaking. So the ones that I was going to pick up with, first of all, are about this vexed question of the sort of strategic needs assessment, how much money, rates, and so forth. Now, one of the questions then is, well, how do we know whether if we raised our rates, that would make a difference? And it seems to me that there's actually some quite important work to be done at the sort of joint strategic needs assessment stage. If we think about the way in which local authorities have been able to bat off historically some of the judicial reviews, which have been challenges to rates, I'm not sure that that quality of work is necessarily going to fly again. And I also think what's interesting, of course, is that sensitivity to rates of pay is going to probably vary region by region. It's not going to be national. And therefore, I think in a way, what a local authority might be said to need to do is to, go back to the drawing board in relation to how it does those assessments and how it engages in its rate setting exercise. Because if you are looking at hundreds, thousands, or a deep problem in provision, and you just get out, the last rate setting exercise you did and you tweak it a bit, that might not be good enough. And you might need to say, well, look, first of all, who have we got queuing, or what types of problem do we have, or what are our projections for the kind of issues we're going to have in this area? How does our market look? Actually engage in a genuine assessment exercise rather than just sort of tweaking a bit with what you've got, because then also you'll be able to engage with this bigger issue, which has also been touched upon in the questions, which is, well, obviously you've got a whole set of obligations, but I think when you do a more thoughtful needs assessment, then you're in a better position to engage in the kind of balancing exercise, which is entirely what you should be doing about how much you're going to allocate for one area of need as against another. I think the other thing is you're also in a better position to go back and make a decision about your precept, or lobby central government, or make a decision about borrowing or council tax. But it's only when you've done that sort of quality of analysis that you can see, well, actually, you could change things in this way, or you need to try and secure funding in another way. But without having done that kind of underlaboring, you're not going to be able to do that. So I don't know whether Sian's got anything particularly she wants to add under that heading, whether I should hand over to Arianna for some of the particularly fiendish cost cap questions.
But before we let Arianna get stuck into the cost cap, I was just going to say that this isn't, although this is a new issue and a response to a fairly unique set of pressures in relation to the care market, actually in some local authority areas this situation has existed in relation to housing for some time, with there being a far greater demand for housing than there is supply, competition between local authorities to secure housing to comply with their duties. And those are pressures that some local authorities, certainly London boroughs and those in the southeast perhaps, have felt for a long time in relation to strategically needing to assess their future needs to provide housing, as well as the demand. And so to some extent there are perhaps lessons to be learned by adult social care departments talking to their housing colleagues about how these issues have been assessed and addressed by housing.
Arianna, do you want to help us with these questions we've been saving just for you?
I'm flattered. I see that we have a very good question in from a not to be named person, as I understand our rule is the charging reforms policy paper published yesterday says independent personal budget used to track the utilization of the cap are to apply the same principles that underpin the calculation of personal budgets under the current system. Do you have a view on whether budgets would still be taken into account to give consistency or not, as the local authority will not actually be funding care yet? And presumably this could have a significant impact on the rate at which the cap is used up when the local authorities start paying. Now, one thing I would note, this is in there was a new document that was released yesterday, which gives slightly more detail on the cap and care cost, but I think we're all really still waiting for the white paper to see the nitty gritty on it. It largely confirms that in respect of counting towards the cap on care cost, this is going to largely track the statutory framework, which is already set out in the CARE Act for it, which is the use of an independent personal budget. In terms of the counting under the independent personal budget, it tracks the cost to the local authority of meeting the person's eligible needs for care and support. And what the document which put out yesterday specifically notes that the same principles that are to be used are the principles of transparency, timeliness, and sufficiency. Now, specifically in a context like this that we're talking about now, I think sufficiency is often a point that is overlooked in both looking at top-ups, and I think will likely be a real bone of contention when the cap on care cost comes into effect, because I've often seen these discussions had around top-ups where people are told that they could get a bed for such and such pound, you could get a bed for £600 a week because we as a local authority could get that. But in reality, that's not possible because right now, none of your framework providers actually have that. So you would have, in reality, had to go somewhere else, pay more in order to get the care provision that the person actually needed. I think this is going to be a real question around the independent personal budget, because there will have to be a decision taken one way or the other by the local authority of saying, is this independent personal budget sufficient to meet your needs? Because if this is a cost of a care provision that's only theoretically to you, theoretically available to you, but in reality, you could never go out and get this. I think you really do have to ask the question as to whether or not that meets the principle of sufficiency from the purposes of the independent personal budget setting, in much the same way if people are told that they'll have to pay a top up because theoretically you could get a bed that you can't get in practice, and you'll have to pay a top up in order to get the bed that you can get in reality. So I think that will be a real question under the cap on care cost. I think there will be sort of these issues about the reality versus the theory of it. And I think that's hopefully something that will be ironed out in the white paper in terms of actually saying, is it going to be the cost to the local authority if they arranged the person's care but didn't let them use framework rates? Or is it going to be a theoretical number which has no actual basis in reality for what the care the person could arrange for themselves?
So I was just going to pick up a couple of extra questions that I was reading while Arianna was talking. One of them was about what the ombudsman might do in the context of a complaint because somebody's saying, well, I haven't got any care, and the local authority wants to say, well, there isn't anything available locally. And I think really that takes me back to some of the points I made right at the outset about, first of all, gathering evidence about the individual case, but then also what I was saying earlier about you need to show that you've done a good quality analysis of your local situation, and just saying, oh, things are very, very difficult locally might soon not be sufficient. And we're also asked about the position of the NHS in relation to nursing care. Certainly I've been involved in the last few months in advising some NHS bodies who've been looking quite creatively at some of these problems. And I certainly think it's right if there is a difficulty in securing particular elements of care, then there might have to be some deeper thinking and consideration about what could be done. Now, I was just going to hand over to Sian to see if she'd got any questions there to finish.
Just on that last point, obviously the idea of a joint strategic needs assessment, the clue is in the word joint, and it is meant to look at the overarching position of both health and social care. And this is probably one of those many occasions when everyone needs to be reminded of their statutory cooperation duties under the Care Act and the National Health Service Act, because clearly this is an issue that impacts health and social care. There's just one question I'm going to raise because I'm sure Fenella knows the answer, and that is the difference between using reasonable endeavours and using best endeavours in terms of trying to demonstrate that all steps have been taken to comply with a duty or to meet a preference.
So I saw that you'd written earlier that you were going to answer that one. I think it's very mean. I think there probably isn't a huge amount of difference. And what a court is always going to do is look at what you've actually done and make a decision about whether, in its view, it's good enough, which is going to be, frankly, hugely discretionary. And that's why, you know, I said at the beginning, you know, try and keep a good record of what you've done in an individual case. And, you know, we contacted X homes over, you know, we went back to them and we asked them this and we tried this other strategy and we looked in the adjacent area and so on. I don't think that a huge amount is ever going to rest on best endeavours. And the case of Kay was one of mine when I was obviously younger and more enthusiastic. And embarrassingly, the court recites one of my submissions was that the health authority shouldn't have taken no for an answer. And it's sort of terrible to be reminded of that. But I think certainly you'll be expected, whatever the phrase is, you know, whether it's from the guidance or whether it's from the case law, of showing that you've made a good job of it. And I don't think in the end a great deal is going to turn on that. I hope, Sian, that wasn't a trick question and Sian's going to tell me there's a case which says
no, I mean it must be context specific and depend on the quality of the evidence. It's obviously almost certainly not going to be good enough to just say, oh well, we don't have the resources. And the extent to which you're expected to demonstrate that is obviously going to depend on the circumstances.
Great. Well, we are just coming up to the end of our webinar. Thank you very much for being such an engaged audience, even though you're all so far away. We realise that this is, you know, an extraordinarily difficult situation and is probably not going to get better anytime soon. And if there are any more legal developments over the autumn, we may leap into action with another webinar. But it's been very, very good to be in touch with you all. Thank you very much.